Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here as well, and also to be sitting next to you and to kind of be reunited again. The title of our report is Towards a New International Development Architecture for LDCs, and I should say at the outset what is the political context of this report. There has been, at the beginning of every decade since 1980, a major UN conference on the least developed countries, which in 1981, 1991 and 2001 came up with a program of action for least developed countries. This is the 49 countries which are identified by the UN system as the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world. So in May 2011, there is going to be another major international conference on the least developed countries, and it will be thinking about some kind of compact or program of action for the coming decade. So, if you like, the fundamental question underlying this report was, how should the international community support the poorest and most vulnerable countries of the world over the next 10 years? That's, I think, what we should be thinking about in this meeting today. That's what the report is about. And one answer to that question might be, well, just continue as before. Let's go on business as usual. Okay, that's one possible answer. You could come to this answer because the LDCs have had rather high growth rates in the 2000s. The last program of action set a growth rate of 7% for the LDCs as a group, and actually achieved it from 2002 to 2007. They also have been relatively resilient in the global recession, so that the LDCs as a group grew at 4.3% in 2009, according to the IMF statistics, whereas developed economies were in deep recession, declining at -3.2%, and emerging and developing countries were still growing, but at 2.3%. So they had a sharp slowdown, but some people are saying they've been resilient, and they've been resilient because of the policies which they have been adopting. So one answer is continue as before. Then there are other, you might say, well, business as usual is not possible. Now, this is our view, and we've put on the cover, and we've tried to put on the cover of the report LDC art. And this is a picture from a Haitian artist, Leopold Lindor. And we put it on the cover to illustrate the extreme vulnerability of the LDCs, but also because we believe that the global financial and economic crisis can be considered a catastrophic event which is analogous to an earthquake. It's a financial earthquake, in fact. This wreaks devastation, but it also offers an opportunity for reconstruction and a new beginning. And essentially, we believe that a new beginning is now necessary, a new approach. We can't continue with business as usual. Now, then the question is, what should be different? What should be different? And I think that's the question, we have before us. Now, one answer might be, well, give them more aid. That's one possibility. One answer might be there are some specific international support mechanisms which are targeted at LDCs. We should strengthen these. And by those LDC international support mechanisms, one of them is preferential market access for LDCs. But you find these in different domains. So, for example, Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement says developed country members shall provide incentives to enterprises and institutions in their territories for the purpose of promoting and encouraging technology transfer to LDCs. Okay, so that's an LDC-specific international support mechanism. So one approach might be, okay, it's not more aid, but let's strengthen the international support mechanisms for LDCs. And these cover aid, trade, technology. And we'll try to improve the partnership approach which has been forged in the last Brussels Programme of Action. Now we're saying not only is more aid not enough, we're also saying this kind of focus on LDC-specific international support mechanisms is not enough. And the basic message of the report is what you need is a new international development architecture for the least developed countries, which includes these LDC-specific international support measures, but also involves changes in the global economic regimes, in particular the financial architecture, trade architecture, the technology architecture, climate change architecture, in a way which is relevant to development and poverty reduction in LDCs. And finally, it also involves enhanced South-South development cooperation. Now, that's the overall argument, and what we try to do in the report is set out in the last 100 pages of the report a positive agenda for this new international development architecture for LDCs. And as I said, this is targeted at the forthcoming UNLDC, the LDC conference. Now, let me, in my presentation, I think what I'd like to talk about is firstly why we think the growth performance of the LDCs, it doesn't really mean that you can't just go on as before. And then secondly, I'd like to look at the effectiveness of the LDC-specific international support mechanisms, and then thirdly, to say why those are not enough, and then finally to look at this idea of the new international development architecture. So I'll go through those quickly through those four things. Now, they have had strong growth and they have been relatively resilient in the crisis. But if you look at things, from a long-term perspective, if I can just, I'm going to flip through a lot of these slides because I think we don't have so much time. If you look at things in a long-term perspective, the growth performance of LDCs as a group falls into three periods. The first one is 1980 to 1994, in which their GDP per capita was actually falling. 1980 to 1994, the GDP per capita was falling. From 1994 to 2000, it starts rising, but rising slowly. In 2000 to 2008, you have this growth acceleration. And so you have a much improved performance, but we find that the LDCs are still lagging behind the other developing countries. We find that the productivity gap is growing, and if you look at things like domestic resource mobilization in terms of savings, things like structural transformation in terms of the share of manufacturing value added in total GDP, you find very little progress being made in the LDCs as a group. Some are doing better than others, but as a whole, they're not making progress in terms of developing their productive capacities. And in terms of their poverty reduction, this has been very slow. These numbers, and the blue line represents data for 34 LDCs. based on a new set of poverty estimates using a method of Masoud Karshenas, which includes both national accounts and household surveys. And you see the same pattern. The incidence of poverty was rising in LDCs until 1994, and then it starts declining with an acceleration in the rate of decline after 2000. But whilst the incidence of poverty is coming down, the numbers of poor people in LDCs is still rising. So even though you had this very strong growth boom, the numbers of poor people are rising still in LDCs. And this reflects the pattern of structural change which is occurring in LDCs. If I can go back to the slide on the structural change, what you find is that there's been a kind of a massive expansion of exports, but it's often related to oil and mineral. Manufacturing GDP has basically stayed flat. Agricultural productivity is lagging behind. And in some sense, the LDCs can be said to be in a kind of blocked structural transition in which more and more people are seeking, there are more and more people entering the labor force every year. And agriculture, its absorptive capacity is declining, and they're just unable both to create productive jobs and livelihoods in agriculture and outside agriculture in manufacturing. And so what we're arguing is that you need kind of new development paths based on the development of productive capacities in these countries. Now, if we turn to MDGs, and there's an analysis of progress towards the MDGs in there, what you see is some acceleration on some indicators, but most LDCs are unlikely to meet most MDGs. So you have a kind of growth boom, but this is not translating into human well-being. And there's very weak development of productive capacities in the country, which we see as the source of resilience in the countries. Now, a second kind of major, so there's a need for a change. The second major message of the report is that the LDC-specific international support measures have had little developmental impact. Now, in looking at that, the way we come to that conclusion is we don't look at the last Brussels Programme of Action. This is the Brussels Programme of Action, which was the last, thing agreed for LDCs. Can I ask how many people have seen this document? Is there anybody who's ever seen this document? Oh, that's good. Okay, 2. Okay, I launched this in New York a couple of days ago with the diplomats, and there were about 6 in a room of about 30 there who had seen this document. Now, this document includes 156 actions which LDCs themselves should have taken, and 178 actions which the international community should have taken. Now, we don't go through all of these. What we do is we focus on 8 actions which we believe are the best case scenario for these international support measures. Now, they're the best case scenario because they refer to WTO issues where the LDC category has been taken up in some form or other, or something which is followed by WIPO, which is the TRIPS agreement, or ODA targets, and which are inscribed in the MDGs. So there are targets for ODA for LDCs that donors should provide 0.15% of their GNI to LDCs. So the question is, has that been followed through? And the untying of aid. There was a DAC recommendation in 2001 to untie aid to LDCs. Has this been followed through? And so what we looked at was the evaluations of these things. What we looked at was the evaluations of these 8 measures. And what you find when you put these evaluations alongside each other is that they're not working, firstly, because of design features, so that they may have exclusions. For example, the decision to untie aid excluded food aid. The preferential market access, you might only give it for a certain proportion of the goods and services imported from LDCs. And these exclusions reduce the value, the developmental value of these measures. And it is also coming through implementation and what happens during the implementation process. And what we found is that whenever there were kind of monetary implications of these measures, they were really not followed through. What you would get is a lot of studies occurring. These studies would identify needs, for example, needs for climate change, adaptation. It might identify needs for trade development, but then following through this into financial follow-up to have concrete measures, this was simply not occurring. The aid shortfall, this is a picture of the aid shortfall according to the target of 0.15% of donors' GNI. And LDCs in 2008 received $37 billion of aid. But if this target would have been met, it would have been $60.7 billion. So that, as you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram, there's a shortfall of $23.7 billion. And this shortfall is actually higher during the period of the 2000s than the period of the 90s, although donors were increasing their aid to LDCs during this period quite significantly. What you find repeatedly in the evaluations of these measures is that de jure something has happened, so that there's been rapid progress in the formal de jure untying of aid by removing legal and administrative impediments to procurement of goods and services. But de facto tying continues, for example, through technical cooperation. And so we see that these international support measures within the technology area, this TRIPS one, for example, the notion of technology transfer is not defined. And the countries have to report on how they are providing incentives to enterprises in their territories for the purposes of promoting and encouraging technology transfer to LDC members. But Australia, for example, argued that its programs designed to promote innovation and competitiveness of the Australian economy. Read that again. This is how they reported it. Programs designed to promote innovation and competitiveness of the Australian economy can in turn contribute to increased transfer of technology into export markets, including LDCs. And this is how they were reporting that they were implementing this agreement. So the international support measures are not effective. There is one area where I think that it is significant, and I'd like to underline this. The United Nations system is prioritizing LDCs, and in quite a significant financial way. Its expenditures on operational activities increased significantly in the 2000s to $7 billion in 2008. And there was also an increase in the share of country-level expenditure of these operational activities, which reached 50% in 2008. So The LDC category is certainly taken very seriously by the UN system, and there is some kind of there is uptake within the international trading system, but I think the problem is that there is incomplete recognition of this category, and particularly there isn't recognition of it within the financial architecture and the aid and the debt relief architecture. For both the World Bank and the IMF, it's not really a kind of significant category. And they work with the notion of low-income countries or heavily indebted poor countries. And the donors are increasingly working with the concept of fragile states. Now, the fragile state concept is a governance category, whereas the LDC is based on structural weaknesses. But because you have the incomplete recognition of the category across the system, it's necessary not to think of what happens in LDCs simply in terms of these LDC-specific support mechanisms, but also in the broader global economic regimes. So what happens in what happens in LDCs, for example, depended highly on what happens with the HIPC initiative. Whether the debt relief came in the 90s, the delay in debt relief in the 90s, the slow progress in the 2000s, that's the key thing. The way in which aid is delivered and the way in which ownership works out, this is critical. Whether there are contingency financing facilities within the global architecture is critical. And so, what we're saying is that even though you need to improve these international support measures, LDCs need also you need to change the global economic regimes which are relevant for development and poverty reduction in the least developed countries. Now, out of that, what we say is you need these improved international support measures, but you need it to be coherent with a new international development architecture. We identify 5 major pillars of this architecture, which are finance, trade, commodities, technology, and climate change. So it's not just simply a matter of aid, but also trade, commodities, technology, and climate change. This is our kind of picture of the architecture, which embraces reform in global economic regimes relevant to LDCs, also South-South development cooperation with the 5 pillars, and improved LDC-specific international support mechanisms at the bottom. I think the most important thing about this architecture is that it's founded on a kind of different perception of these countries. I think these countries are seen in terms of need, and what we're trying to see them in terms of is potential. We're trying to see them in terms of their unreleased potential. And we think that the countries themselves must take the lead in their development strategies. So country ownership is a vital principle, and policy space is a vital principle. But essentially what we're seeking is to try to develop, to have new inclusive development based on the expansion of their productive capacities. Now this, in our view, requires different roles for the market and the state. It needs a more developmental role for the state to try to build up the productive base of the economy and try to promote structural transformation to increase investment and innovation. This would also involve a better balance between external and domestic markets and also resources. This would involve greater domestic resource mobilization, policy coherence between the pillars, and the international support mechanisms embedded within the global economic regimes, and more democratic and universal participation in the global system of governance. We don't talk about that very much, voice and representation. We put in the report a lot of specific proposals in each of these areas, and I've distributed, I think, a kind of summary of those proposals has been distributed. But I think maybe I'll stop there, Andy, and then you know, maybe we can get into the specific proposals in the discussion. Or should I go on a little further?
I think maybe if you could give just a very brief overview of the proposals, because I think this is obviously a very complex, sort of wide-ranging report, but it has a one-liner, which is that we need a new development architecture. And I think the discussion could usefully focus on that one-liner. So I think you should give a sense of the content.
Okay, all right. Okay, so for each of these pillars, we have you know, specific proposals, and these proposals relate to the LDC-specific international support measures, and also global economic regimes. So in the financed area, for the global economic regimes, the critical issues relate to increased domestic resource mobilization, in which we have a proposal there, which we're kind of collating proposals which are already out there in many cases, which is related to tax cooperation, financial cooperation against illegal capital outflows, and then enhanced country ownership of aid delivery. In terms of the international support mechanisms, we think it's important that the donors meet their aid commitments, but then a critical thing is that more ODA goes into developing productive capacities. So this is a greater share of ODA to production sectors and infrastructure. Part of this is traditional uses of aid, but we also believe that there is a need for innovative uses of aid for private sector development, and I'll talk about one of those in the technology area in a moment. In the trade area, we're saying that a conclusion to the Doha round, which is developmental, has a developmental content, will be significant for LDCs, but we're also focusing mostly on kind of international support mechanisms. The LDCs themselves have negotiated what they call an early harvest from the Doha round, one element of which is duty-free and quota-free access, and we're arguing that that should be delinked from the conclusion of the round, this early harvest. We're also arguing that it's necessary to ensure that the enhanced integrated framework works more effectively in delivering aid for trade, and that this should not simply be for trade facilitation, but also for technological development. The commodities pillar focuses particularly on reducing volatility, commodity price volatility, or reducing the negative impact of commodity price volatility. And so we talk about a transaction tax on commodity derivatives to try to reduce the effect of speculation on commodity price behavior. And then we talk about contingency financing facilities for commodity-dependent countries to offset the risks. But we're also arguing there for increased financial and technical assistance for managing resource rents and supporting resource-based diversification. So the commodity area is something which is basically neglected at the moment. The aid and the trade area are kind of, you know, they're well-worn areas, but essentially we're introducing this commodity. We say you can't ignore the commodity issue if you're dealing with LDCs. And we're also saying that the technology issue should also be looked at. And we include in there some specific international support mechanisms. We have a proposal for setting up national technology funds, which would then be internationally financed by donors. So it isn't an idea of a kind of vertical technology fund for LDCs, but it's an idea of a national funding bodies who would then be vertically financed, and that would be trying to increase enterprise innovation. So I think in these commodities and technology area, there are kind of new proposals there. The aid and the trade one, I think they're going over somewhat old ground or ideas which are around there. But I think in terms of aid, we see aid not being used to meet kind of needs, but more being used to leverage development finance, to promote domestic resource mobilization, to promote domestic investment. And then under climate change, we see that the kind of the architecture for climate change adaptation and mitigation is rather a mess, and so this needs to be worked out. And then we're talking about international support mechanisms to scale up financing of the LDC fund, which is already there, and to try to incorporate assistance mainstream it into national development strategies. So that gives a flavour, perhaps, of the thing. South-South cooperation is also an important element, and we see this as being enhanced during the coming period. I think finally, I'd like to say that this report, it's basically building on what we've done over a number of years, and this is the kind of the 8 reports which we've done. Right. So thank you very much indeed.
Charlie, thank you very much.